Since in the Oedipus, the concept of coding has been used so often, being paired with territorialization, but at the same time in contrast with it. Code refers to cipher, mark, and rule, etc., which is commonly used in relation to information in communication or language activity. To understand what the other person is saying, we need to know the code used for that word. Not to mention the grammar, we also need to know the rule for articulating sounds and words. It is not easy for Koreans to distinguish between punk and funk because there is no articulation rule to distinguish between P and F. These two are very different kinds of music, but they get the same significance in Koreans. The same goes for speaking. If a Korean doesn't make it clear that the sound he's going to make is a word that begins with an F by making a sound of wind licking between the teeth and the lip, any American will say what you're talking about, even he says "fuck you" at the top of his voice, because there is no F pronunciation in Korean. If you pronounce as usual, it will be pronounced as "fuck you." If the person understands what you meant to say later, he may laugh, saying, "Was it a swearing?" Even when you swear, you have to abide by the code. The cipher is encoded so that the meaning cannot be understood, but at the same time, it should be able to be understood by the recipient. For this purpose, a certain hidden code is used. Coding means to encode the rule of sign uses like this and makes the users use the sign according to the rule. On the contrary, deviating from the given rule of sign usage is called decoding. Creating a new rule of the signs that deviated from the rule is referred to as recoding. It should be noted that it is different from the usual meaning of information theory or communication theory, where changing certain signs into different signs according to the set rule is referred to as coding, and returning encoded signs to the original signs by the same rule is referred to as decoding. Genetic information consisting of A, T, G, and C and the process of making proteins also work through codes. 3 nucleotides combine to form a code of amino acids, and the amino acid molecules are combined together according to another code to make the protein. However, in the process of RNA copying and transmitting the genetic code of DNA, decoding occurs due to various factors such as splicing, transposon, and retroviruses. Genetic engineering is a technology that uses reverse transcription genes to recode the genetic code for a certain purpose. As such, coding, decoding, and recoding occur routinely not only in the stratum of signification, but also in the stratum of organism. The word code refers to not only law or regulation, but also rules that are not so explicit. There are many codes such as social status code, professional code, gender code, and various culture codes that regulate religious ritual, table manners, dress, and cooking. Etiquettes at the times of meeting and parting, traffic signals, and rules of game are also codes. Wherever humans live, there are codes. Society demands and compels its members to faithfully obey the rules given to them. When faithfully obeying the social code, one becomes a subject required by the society. The society code constitutes and maintains the stratum of subjectification like this. The social code, however, divides the society into groups that follow different codes and hierarchizes them. Freemen and slaves, aristocrats and peasants are groups of different qualities that can never be grouped in a single category such as human beings. The caste system, which maintains the strict division of Brahmin, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Sudra, is a system that intensifies the discontinuity and hierarchicality of these coded groups to the extreme degree. Subjectification produces different subjects according to these divided different codes. The existence of these different codes raises questions and resistances for those belonging to different groups. This is why the struggles against social status have been repeated historically. Attempts to deviate from the given code are constantly occurring, if not in the mode of struggle. Some are running away from serfdom or slavery in search of freedom, while others are being expelled from the community and adrift. Some people wear different clothes and choose different lovers, freeing themselves from the coercion of gender codes. It is drawing a line of light deviating from the stratum of subjectification. When these lines of light form a collective outflow, a decoded flow is formed from the given code. When the decoded flow overflows, codes that used to form strata such as status, occupation, and gender are destroyed. For example, the Western feudal society was dismantled by the decoded flow of running away to the city and by the decoded flow of peasants who lost their land by enclosure movement and got turned into vagrants. However, when this decoded flow overflows, society, order, or government becomes impossible. There usually occur attempts to capture this flow with other codes. Attempts to recode occur. In some cases, coding breaks down the existing different codes and links the decoded flows, uniting them into one huge code. This is called overcoding. For example, Qin, the first great empire of China, united former tribal groups and small states into a single state. This leads to a decoded flow that deviates from the social status and occupation that belonged to the code of the previous society. The empire state territorializes the on new territories according to imperial needs such as mining or smelting. This is the case for territorialization, being paired not with coding but with decoding. In addition, Qin dynasty imposes new weights and measures, currency, letters, and calendars. The old codes are dismantled and overcoded into a single new code. However, in this case, because the new division and hierarchy of the groups such as status and occupation is reintroduced, this overcoding still is a kind of coding. On the other hand, there is a case where the decoded flow is integrated into a codeless system in the sense that it does not divide the decoded flow into hierarchical groups again and does not assign different codes to each group, although it is a kind of overcoding. There appears a huge flow of vagrants who are deprived of their lands due to the enclosure movement, and they are free from status servitude because they already lost their occupations and social statuses. It is when this flow of potential labor force that territorialized from the land and decoded from the status meets the flow of capital that capitalism is born. Capitalism doesn't recode them back on status. In the marketplace, status doesn't matter at all. The only thing that matters is how much you pay for my commodities. The logic of the market gives everyone this kind of equivalence. A universal category of human emerges from this. Previously, the status code regulated what to do for a living and how to act. When the code disappears, these regulations become impossible. Hobbes' question, how is society possible, comes from this. Capitalism establishes a system of universal rules that applies to all humans other than the code set by status. Get a job through employment, produce value through labor. You cannot eat unless you work, buying and sell goods by equivalent exchange. The measure of all values is money, etc. This is also a kind of overcoding in that it integrated the entire flow that deviated from the previous code into a single system of universal rules. However, this is certainly different from the previous imperial overcoding that divided people into groups with hierarchical status and imposed different rules depending on groups they belong to. This is called axiomatization in that it was integrated into a system of universal rules that seem self-evident like a kind of axiom. Just as the deterritorialization movement that occurred within a stratum is reterritorialized on another territory, the decoded flow is also destined to be recorded. However, although decoding destroys the existing code on a large scale and gets rid of it, it is often by just changing a particular element slightly too. European classical music has various codes overlapped. Codes of harmony tonality, codes of the musical forms such as counterpoint and sonata, codes of genre such as concerto and symphony, etc. A piece of music drawn as a score is the result of overlapping these multiple codes. From the relation with performance, a score can be said to be another code in that it is a kind of rule that causes the performer's action to be repeated. The performer must play by that score code. However, even in this case, the speed or tempo provides moments for decoding while leaving the given rhythm pattern or melody as it is. Although tempo symbols such as andante and presto are written on the score, the tempo itself changes each time the score is played. The performer sometimes changes it greatly to emphasize his own interpretation. Glenn Gould creates his own color by playing slow ones even slower and fast ones even faster. The performer can change the intensity of the sound of the musical instrument, such as touch, while leaving the score as it is. Jazz musicians change the melody by following the theme work. These are margins that enable flexibility and elasticity deviating from the given order words of the score. The variability that this margin allows enables decoding by itself. Deleuze Guattari called this margin of decoding. The same goes for language. Even when we read or say the same sentence, we do it in a different tone. If the tone is raised up close to screaming or uttered in a very low voice like Zumi, Mongolian throat singing method, the original meaning in the sign disappears and turns into a non-verbal sound. Oh, this is the sound of an animal. The phonetic tone here provides a margin of decoding that deviates from the language that signifies. When this sound is repeated and comes to have a new rule, it is recorded in a different type of sound. Using irregular pulse, which breaks the regularity of accent, in the dance music The Rite of Spring, Stravinsky decoded the time structure of the Western music. Using the rhythm of non-Western music, machine records its decoded beats on a new rhythm mode. As such, the decoding and recoding that occurs through the margin of decoding is called transcoding. Such transcoding is usually to take off a part out of the chains of the code and use it to one's own gain. Deleuze Guattari called this capturing the surplus value of code. All code is made up of two or more fragments. These fragments are connected by a chain. Because all the fragments are tied to a chain, it is difficult for them to escape freely. However, some fragments can be taken off through the margin of decoding and be used in a different way. In this case, the fragment that was taken off has a different value than the original one. It is about taking advantage of the virtuality of that fragment. This is called surplus value, and that is more than the original value. Such a surplus value is the surplus value of code, in that it is a surplus value that exceeds the value within its original code. To use a fragment of a particular code through transcoding is to appropriate such a surplus value for one's own gains. This is referred to as the capture of surplus value. It can be said that the musical performers mentioned above take off the sound that the composer coded on the musical scores or existing music and capture the surplus value of code for the sake of their own musical interpretation or style. However, if this is all about the surplus value, one may ask back if the concept of surplus value, originally defined by Marx as an economic concept, is dissolved into the subjective concept of interpretation. This is not quite the case. Looking at the case of economics first, the profit from selling commodities through the remote trade is exactly the surplus value of code. The use value and exchange value of commodities are coded differently from society to society. Beef intestines and bones are not eaten in the United States, but they are good food ingredients in Korea. Deer horns are of little use in Russia, but they are precious ingredients of Oriental medicine in Korea. As such, when fragments such as intestines or horns are taken off from the coded chain of value in a particular society and transferred to another society with a different code, the surplus value generated from code differences can be captured. The gains made by the merchants from remote trade show the economic form of the surplus value of the code. The surplus value of code is found everywhere in the survival of living things. The pollination of orchids, where the orchid seduce wasps by imitating the shape of wasp, and the mimicry of Bacillotrophilia that imitates the leaves of the neighboring plants are exactly the cases where living things capture the surplus value of code from other individuals for their survival. It is thanks to the gene code of the retrovirus called ERV3 in the human genome that human fetus in the uterus can avoid the mother's immune response. It is about obtaining the surplus value of code by capturing the gene fragments that originally belonged to the genetic chain of the virus. The ligaturists word that the place of life means the surplus value of that stratification can be understood in this context. It is said that the human genome contains more genes of viruses or microbes than human genes. The unintentional symbiosis of alpha proteobacteria and archaea implies that the genetic traits of animals or plants themselves are constructed by decoding the genes of heterogeneous microorganisms. A code is inseparable from a process of decoding that is inherent to it. There is no genetics without genetic drift. The modern theory of mutations has clearly demonstrated that a code, which necessarily relates to the population, has an essential margin of decoding. This involves not translation between codes, but a singular phenomenon we call surplus value of code, or side communication. However, in Anti-Oedipus, the concept of surplus value of code is sometimes used in a slightly different nuance than this. For example, in some ritualized and ceremonial gifts such as potlatch and kula, the disequilibrium between the gifts exchanged stands out markedly. It's a game where the person who gives more than he received wins. Here, the one that gives more acquires prestige. This is a factor that recovers the disequilibrium between the gifts given and taken, which is called the surplus value of code in this book. Nietzsche says there is an odd equation at the origin of punishment where the criminal should be given as much pain as the damage he caused. This is possible because of the pleasure the eyes get from the pain of the criminal, and this pleasure is said to be the surplus value of the code. This means a certain price that is paired with the disequilibrium caused by the gift or debt in a particular code, rather than the surplus value gained from the use of fragments of code. This is not something that arises from the transition to another code, but a certain gain that is within a given code but is not explicit. The concept of this nuance disappears by the time of 1000 Palladius, and the surplus value of code is clearly limited to a concept corresponding to transcoding that transfers fragments of a particular code to another code.